So you are here to hear about the Innocence Project. Today we have with us co-founder Barry Scheck, who will also be introducing a very special guest of his own. Please help me welcome Barry Scheck.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here. And what we hope to do in the short time we have with you, and we will certainly be taking your questions, is give you a brief introduction to the Innocence Project and the Innocence Network. That's a series of organizations that do this work. But the best ambassadors, the best advocates, the people that really share with the country, with legislators, with decision makers, with judges, with prosecutors, with defense lawyers, with everyone. What this work is all about are our clients, the exonerated. And so we are really privileged today to have here Kevin Richardson, one of the defendants in the Central Park 5 case. Come on up, Kevin. So what we thought we'd do, an unusual format for lawyers like me, and I apologize. I know I'm here at Google, and I apologize for wearing a suit and tie, but I had to go to court in the morning. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done that, out of respect for you. Okay, so let's get to it right away. This should work, right? There we go. Oh, went too many.
That's cool.
Okay. The mission of the Innocence Project is to free wrongly convicted people through DNA testing and reform the system responsible for their unjust imprisonment anywhere in the world. It's the old mission. Martin Luther King said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And we seek to establish as an international human right that in every legal system, adversarial or inquisitional, because, you know, in some countries, many in Europe, you have legal systems, what they call inquisitional, meaning that judges essentially do the investigation. And it's not the typical adversary system we have here. However, in every one of these systems, what we find, innocent people get convicted. And the international human right we'd like to establish is that there should be a viable process in place to be able to rectify a case where an innocent person is convicted. Viable process. Now, in 1989, we had the first DNA exoneration in the United States. By 1992, my co-founder and co-director Peter Neufeld and I started the Innocence Project as a clinical program at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law, which is just a few blocks away from here. By 2004, we had an independent nonprofit entity. But what's most important is that over the years, almost from the outset, we had partners at law schools, in public defenders' offices, all across the country that we call an Innocence Network. And we have 69 organizations worldwide in the Innocence Network, 56 in the United States. And let me be the first to tell you that in the other organizations within our network, we use both DNA and non-DNA evidence to prove people are innocent. And we do that too at the Innocence Project, use non-DNA evidence. Here, just very briefly, the numbers. There have been 351 post-conviction DNA exonerations in 37 states, 20 people sentenced to death since 1989. And we start with 1989 as the beginning of the innocence era because that's when we first began upsetting expectations of everyone in the legal system that there were a lot more innocent people than anybody ever knew about through the DNA testing. And the reason that we focus on the DNA testing, and if you go to the Innocence Project website, you'll see these numbers and broken down by race, by states, every way you can imagine, is that nobody's arguing with these 351 exonerations. They are all actually innocent. They didn't do it. And it's interesting to note that In 150 of these cases, the person who really committed the crime has been identified. So no one argues this. There is a website that I want to urge you to look at called the National Registry of Exonerations, which our colleagues and partners run. It's now at University of Irvine Law School, Michigan State, University of Michigan. And there we are keeping track of an instrumental number, the best the legal system can do. And that is cases where there is new evidence of innocence that leads to a conviction being vacated, being thrown out, and then the case is dismissed, or somebody, in a few instances, not many, go back to trial and they're acquitted. Now, in these cases, that is the best definition that the legal system can come to in deciding when there's been a mistake or actually innocent. The people that run the registry would be the first to tell you that we can't say that absolutely every one of those people is actually innocent in the way that we can say it in the DNA cases. But the truth is that the vast, overwhelming majority of them are innocent. And what's good about the registry is that we now have, since 1989, 2,089 cases where we've been able to demonstrate that innocent people were convicted, new evidence of innocence, cases dismissed, and we're not even counting mass exonerations, and there have been plenty of those. And it makes it easier to look at the data and make a deep dive into an analysis of this problem of innocent people being convicted, which is a whole field of scholarship, and we're first just getting into it. So take a look at the registry. It's worth looking at. Now, we know about the causes of wrongful convictions, eyewitness misidentification, 71% of the wrongful convictions in our DNA cases, misapplication of forensic science in 45% of them, and in the Central Park 5 case, which, as you'll hear, was primarily a false confession case, we still had bad forensic science. There were hairs that were found on the poor young woman known as the Central Park jogger, and they tried to claim that some of these hairs came from the defendants, looking at it microscopically, just under a microscope. And we know that a lot of that microscopic hair comparison evidence is notoriously unreliable. We were then able to do DNA testing many years later on the shafts of those hairs, something called mitochondrial DNA testing, and able to demonstrate that the hairs didn't come from any of these defendants. And indeed, the source of the hairs, as you'll hear, comes from the person who really committed that crime. So 45% misapplication of forensic science, a huge cause of wrongful convictions. False confessions in 28% of the cases, but close to, I think, half of the homicides, something like that. Incentivized informant, a huge problem around this country. That, by the way, is a picture of Betty Ann Waters, and that's her brother Kenny Waters. And it's a wonderful movie you might want to take a look at called Conviction, starring Hilary Swank, Sam Rockwell, directed by Tony Goldwyn. Isn't he the President of the United States? Last time I looked. But it's worth looking at. That's that case. Inadequate representation. We all know that's a terrible cause of wrongful convictions. Prosecutorial misconduct, the field that we focus on a lot. That's Michael Morton in Texas. And we, at the Innocence Project and in the Innocence Network, we're kind of the headquarters. We have a network support unit, but we go around the country, both lobbying in Congress for legislation and in every state. So when we started the Innocence Project, there were no states that gave you a right to get post-conviction DNA testing. Now all 50 states have such a bill. They could even be improved, but at least all 50 states, and in Congress and the federal government, we have such a bill. In 31 states, we have legislation that requires the preservation of evidence, so you can go back years later and prove people are innocent. Recording of interrogations that we're going to discuss a lot today. This is a critical reform. We're talking about beginning to videotape an interrogation from the time of Miranda warnings, not as in the Central Park 5 case, after they tune people up, as they used to say at NYPD Blue, interrogate them for hours, and then after it's all over and all the coercion has taken place and all the feeding of facts, they come in and they begin a videotape later. That's not videotaping of interrogation in any meaningful way. Eyewitness identification. In 19 states, we've been able to seriously change the different methods of doing identification procedures, whether it's photo arrays or lineups, to reduce the risk of error and trying to enhance the capability of law enforcement to get correct identifications. Forensic science, we're working on it. It was just we had a National Commission on Forensic Science that came about after the National Academy of Science in 2009 issued a groundbreaking report. But the National Commission is a thing of the past. After the election, it was disbanded. So we are still working everywhere to expand policy reforms. We're focusing more on indigent defense, on criminal courts, and particularly what we call America's guilty plea problem. The issue of innocent people pleading guilty to crimes they didn't commit. That's one of our earliest clients, Chris Ochoa, who pled guilty to a homicide in Texas, under literally being threatened with, if you don't confess to this crime, you're going to get executed. We will needle you, is precisely what they told Chris. Confessed to a crime that he didn't commit. Now he's graduated from the University of Wisconsin Law School and is a lawyer and works hard in the innocence movement. But we're really focusing on innocent people pleading guilty in the misdemeanor courts, because one of the major issues, as you all know, I hope, is bail reform, is making sure that people are not kept in jail just because they can't afford bail, where they wind up pleading guilty to crimes they didn't commit. And misdemeanors, or what they call low-level felonies, it has huge collateral consequences for people everywhere. But because we have Kevin here, and he is so kind to come and share his experiences with us today, let us talk about one of the truly historic cases in the modern history of American jurisprudence. It really is. The Central Park jogger case. I'm looking around the room and I think a lot. How many of you have heard of it? Well, that's a lot. I think it's probably true because of the wonderful movie that Sarah Burns and Dave McMahon, her husband, made called The Central Park Five. How many of you saw that movie? Let the record reflect a lot of the same people raised their hands. It's a terrific movie, and you all should go see it and get it online. But this case started in April of 1989 when a young woman who was an investment banker, actually a wonderful person who's overcome horrible injuries, was jogging in Central Park, as was her habit and pattern, when she was mugged. That night in Central Park, there were other instances of people being attacked and mugged in the park. They called it wilding as a slang term, and they developed this term of super predators. But the jogger herself, as she was called in those days, was found like in a ditch, horribly beaten, stabbed. It's a miracle that she lived through the experience. And this is what the newspaper headlines looked like. But the long story short, and I'll tell just a short version of the story, the involvement of the Innocence Project in this case is, strangely enough, after Kevin and his colleagues were convicted in, I guess, 2 trials. Yes. And all 5 of them went to jail for different periods of time. And the city was convinced that these young men, these so-called super predators, as they were called, they saw their confessions on television and nobody was showing any remorse, right, which was a big deal. And of course they weren't showing remorse because they were innocent. They didn't do anything, right? But years later, we at the Innocence Project got a letter from a man named Matthias Reyes. And Matthias Reyes wrote to us and one other lawyer in New York City and said, you know what? I'm the person that committed that crime. I'm the one that attacked the jogger. And of course, he was in jail himself for murder. What's really extraordinary about this is that a friend, a very good lawyer who was working in the New York City District Attorney's Office named Harlan Levy, wrote a book called, he was their DNA expert. He wrote a book called And the Blood Cries Out. And the first chapter in the book is about Matthias Reyes being convicted with DNA evidence for a break-in murder. And by the way, he always tried to bash the eyes of his victims so nobody could identify him. And the jogger, of course, her eyes were in that state as well, broken sockets. But the beginning of the book is look at the power of DNA evidence. Then he has another chapter in the book talking about how he advised the prosecutors, Elizabeth Lederer and Linda Fairstein and others who prosecuted the Central Park Five, to get around the fact that there was semen evidence that didn't come back to any of the defendants nor the jogger's boyfriend that was found on the vaginal swabs and on the shorts, as I recall. That's part of the book. And little did he know that years later, Matthias Reyes would come forward. Matthias Reyes said to the Innocence Project, I'm the person who really committed the crime. This is really how, one of the things we want to discuss, I want you to really focus on, is when you have these media storms in a case like this. Those of you that are New Yorkers, I'm looking around the room, ask your parents what this was like, and we're going to discuss it in a second with Kevin. There was, talk about the Daily News, there was wall-to-wall coverage. Everybody was obsessed with this case. It came at a terrible time where crime was spiking, where you had an epidemic of narcotics distribution in this city, and people were scared. Reyes came forward years later. He said, I really committed this crime. And we then took this to the New York County prosecutors. And there are two of them that I want to single out for praise, because I want it clear that in the criminal justice reform movement that we hope is really taking off now, those who are progressive prosecutors, who are willing to admit mistakes and reinvestigate fearlessly, they must be praised. And this never would have happened unless Peter Casolaro and Nancy Ryan agreed to take this on. There were a number of reporters in the city that had heard that something was cooking, and all the lawyers involved in the case were able to keep this quiet for 7 months in New York City. 7 months while they reinvestigated the case. Now, I don't know, I'm sure here at Google you all appreciate 7 months with an incendiary story like this. To keep that quiet is a miracle, right? But that was done, and it gave Nancy and Peter the opportunity, along with their own DA investigators, to independently investigate this, to go talk to Reyes. They actually found another case right by that area in Central Park where Reyes, a day or two before, had committed another sexual assault, a vicious one that was never prosecuted, and partly because they couldn't find anybody, and the victim of that case moved to California. But it was the same MO, the same person, Matthias Reyes. And then, of course, by the time that they were reinvestigating, they'd known he'd gone on to commit murders. And they also, in their reinvestigation, he didn't know any of the 5 defendants, right? And the way it wound up is that they did this massive reinvestigation. They corroborated everything Reyes said. It was completely consistent with the DNA evidence, with the hair evidence, with the forensic evidence at the scene, everything, and with a timeline. Because the truth is, the timeline never made any sense in the Central Park jogger case. And at the time, many people pointed that out. So they presented their case to District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. By that time, word had gotten out. The police department began reinvestigating, and the prosecutors in the case, and they made a huge presentation to Mr. Morgenthau saying, no, we think they're still guilty. we stand behind this. And Morgenthau, to his credit, they filed a huge affidavit in court detailing the entire investigation and agreed to vacate the conviction. And that is, if you're interested historically, is an important document for you to take a look at. So, Matthias Reyes pled guilty to that crime. Everybody knows that he was, well, he didn't plead guilty because the statute of limitations had run, but everybody agrees that he is the person that committed the crime, and the convictions were vacated. Very long story short, took years, but there was massive civil litigation in this case, and the city of New York and our corporation counsel, Zach Carter, who was a U.S. attorney in this city and is a great, great lawyer, all agree that these young men are innocent, and they settled a civil case for many millions of dollars, and that, believe me, wouldn't have happened unless everybody was completely, in the city, completely convinced in the corporation counsel's office that they were innocent. There are still some people that, to this day, I think it's an example of a certain kind of cognitive bias where you can't let go, still insist that they're guilty. But any reasonable person, I think, examining the evidence can't reach that conclusion. So, what do we make of this, and why is this case so important? Well, one reason, of course, has to do with trying to get up the number of states that videotape interrogation and actually look at the way that people are interrogated to make sure that we don't have this problem of false confessions, which is incredibly difficult and pernicious. But how do you get that done? I'll never forget that just before, and I was telling Kevin this the other day, just before we went to announce in court that the Central Park Five were going to have their convictions vacated, somebody from the New York Civil Liberties Union and myself went to one of the deputy mayors in the city of New York and what was going on and said, this is the time to videotape interrogations. Let's make sure there are no errors. We'll see exactly what happens from Miranda warnings forward. And we said, use this as the time. And the truth is, because of the real pushback by the police department after Morgenthau vacated the conviction, we had enormous trouble getting videotaping interrogations passed in this state. And it didn't happen until last year. And I'm going to show you right now why it happened.
My name is Raymond Santana.
My name is Kevin Richardson.
My name is Yusuf Salam. I'm one of the Central Park Five. In 1989, we were falsely arrested and convicted for crimes that we didn't commit.
We were kids at the time.
We spent precious years of our life in prison.
I was deprived of my rights and interrogated behind closed doors.
The public never got a chance to see how these false confessions started. They only saw the ending.
We want you to see the whole process from beginning to end.
From beginning to the end.
There's a bill now that will look in the past.
This bill will require police to record in full custodial interrogations.
If this bill would have been passed in '89, I wouldn't have lost 7 years of my life.
It's in Albany's hands to act. The time is now.
Well, if we didn't have that ad, that, by the way, was filmed by Sarah Burns and David McMahon, who made the Central Park Five movie, we wouldn't have been able to get this done. And we just were able to get this done finally this year. The videotaping will go into effect in June of next year, but the bill was passed this spring. So this is an effort that has to go on in all the states in this country that do not videotape interrogations from Miranda warnings forward. And I'm glad to say that the FBI recently agreed to do that. But why is the Central Park jogger case so important? It's not just because 5 innocent young men wound up pleading guilty and wound up giving confessions that were videotaped that had all these details. It has a lot to do with race in America, and has a lot to do with our culture, and it has a lot to do with our current president. So first, Raymond, let me ask you, Raymond, Kevin.
We look alike. It's fine. It's fine. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tell us how you were arrested.
Good afternoon, Google.
Yeah. Going back to 1989, I say it's a young crowd, so during that time I was 14 years old. So 1989, I remember it was an Easter vacation, so excited to be out for a few days. I lived across the street from Central Park, 110th Street. So I went to the park quite often to go swimming and to play basketball and play football, actually. So I remember that night, it was a group of guys forming to go into the park. I remember a friend of mine told me, oh, don't go, like stay and play basketball, but I wanted to go anyway. The only thing I was guilty of that night was being a follower. Because I went into the park not thinking anything was gonna happen. So going into the park, I remember a lot of kids forming together, and I see like a guy with a bike going by, and I see him being attacked. Then I'm telling myself, this is not my kind of crowd. And I had a curfew that night. I was still 14 years old, so I was scared of breaking my curfew more than anything. So I remember walking out of the park on 5th Avenue. If you're familiar with Manhattan, Central Park, it's 5th Avenue. So I remember walking back home, and it was kind of late, and I formed up with a few guys I didn't know, and we all was walking upward, 5th Avenue. And it was a police van that swung around the kids. And me, growing up during that time in the 80s, even if you were innocent, when you seen police, you became afraid. So what I do, I ran. Everybody else ran, so I ran as well. So I remember turning back to the wall in Central Park. So I jumped back into the park, and I rolled around in mud because there was a whole bunch of grass and things like that. So there's one thing I remember that it still stands to this day. When there's a white police officer, he told me, stay, don't run or I'll shoot. So I kept running. And all I remember feeling someone like a physical being over me. And I remember him tackling me. And at this age, I did not look this size. I was very slim. And all I remember is him taking his police helmet and hit me in my face. And during that time, I remember like blacking out a little bit. I felt my face feeling a little swollen. If you look back in the film and you see when they show the videotape confession, my eye was a little swollen. I remember asking the police officer, what are you doing? I'm innocent. And he said, didn't I tell you you freed your little animal? And that always stood out to me. During that time, I remember I was really dirty, and I remember handcuffing me. And they took us out of the park and put us back in the police car. And I was there with another young kid, which I did not know. And another police car was, come to find out, was Raymond Santana, which I didn't know at the time, but they portrayed that like we were gang or we were some type of cult, that we was gangs and stuff, which I did not know him at all. And that was the first time I met Raymond Santana, actually. So from that point, we was drove to the Central Park precinct. Like I said, at that time, the thing I'm most afraid of is breaking my curfew. Can you imagine? Because my mother, she raised us to, be responsible. And I know that weekend it was an Easter vacation. And I said, I can hang out a little bit more, just being a normal 14-year-old teenager. So I remember going to the precinct and being with other individuals. Well, I come to find out it was Yusuf Salaam, Raymond Santana.
And you didn't know them?
No.
And that's what's extraordinary. And we're not going to focus right now, because we don't have the time, on the methods that were used to coerce the confession from Kevin, the good cop, bad cop routines, and feeding facts about how the crime really occurred, that in theory only the police and the real perpetrator would know. And look at the movie, read the literature. You really need to read this literature. But one of the things that only Kevin can share with us, take a look at this picture. See that picture of the protesters of the Central Park Five as they're entering court? And this has always troubled me enormously because I remember all of this. I was a practicing criminal defense lawyer. I was teaching at Cardozo Law School. I'd been a public defender. I knew something about DNA evidence, so informally I was trying to assist the lawyers in this case, at least explain what it was. But all of us involved in the criminal justice system were watching this unfold. And it's just hard to imagine that how it was for you, Kevin, if you could tell us what it was like every day to walk into court, right, and face trial with these crowds outside of the courtroom. Can you explain for us what this atmosphere was like?
During this time was 89, 1990. Almost a full year went by. And instead of enjoying regular activity like a kid, just being outside, going to, just hanging out, my everyday life was going to court 5 days a week. And I was so sheltered during this time and scared to even be outside because I didn't think what people thought of me. You know, because we was portrayed so much. During the 80s, it was such a media frenzy. During that time, there was a lot of racial things going on. And because of this, it was like paparazzi around us every day. They used to come into actually where I live and used to interview people and neighbors and try to look for us. We were like physically scared to come outside. And at this time, I was already, I was 15 years old at the time. I remember my family just hovering over me going to court, you know, taking a train and getting out in Canal Street and walking to the courthouse and seeing these signs. And my mother seeing this signs about her children and the other 5 as well. And just experiencing that at 14 years old, it's hard for anybody for that matter, but being so young and naive, I thought I was in a nightmare and I actually didn't wake up from it. And just going through this, I thought every day, what's gonna happen to me? What's gonna happen to my mother? You know, because of this, my mother, she became ill. She caught a stroke actually in the courtroom and they had to rush her to the hospital when I was on trial. You know, so just, it takes me back just seeing the sign and just seeing things like this because people didn't, like they rushed to judgment, like, but they didn't know that my character. You know, they didn't know I was raised by 5 women, you know, so it's hard.
And this picture shows you just one side. There was white people on one side, people from the black community and the Latino community on the other, screaming at each other as people walk in to this courthouse. It was a pretty terrifying atmosphere. And one of the things that happened is that this man, Donald Trump, put an ad in the newspapers, a full-page ad, calling for the death penalty to be brought back. And what we have done is we have given you at Google, and it'll be online here, a copy of this ad. And what is it? What's the hashtag that we use? I'm sorry? Yeah. Did you all hear that? Yeah. Okay. We'll put it in the tape, right? For the and you really need to read this document, right? You really need to read it and take it home with you and look at it, or look at it on your phone at some point. But in this ad, the businessman Donald Trump went on Larry King. Looks a lot different than he does today, but he was not being ostracized for taking this position. And the kinds of things he said were in this ad, quote, "At what point did we cross the line from the fine and noble pursuit of genuine civil liberties to the reckless and dangerously permissive atmosphere which allows criminals of every age to beat and rape a helpless woman and then laugh at her family's anguish?" And then he goes on to criticize, of all people, Mayor Koch. Now, Mayor Koch was a real law and order guy, all right? But even Mayor Koch, during this period of time, he's criticizing. He says, quote, "Mayor Koch has stated that hate and rancor should be removed from our hearts. I do not think so. I want to hate these muggers and murderers. They should be forced to suffer, and when they kill, they should be executed for their crimes. They must serve as examples for others, so that others will think long and hard before committing a crime or an act of violence. Yes, Mayor Koch, I want to hate these murderers, and I always will. I am not looking to psychoanalyze or understand them. I am looking to punish them. If the punishment is strong, the attacks on innocent people will stop." I recently watched a newscast trying to explain the, quote, "anger in these young men," unquote. I no longer want to understand their anger. I want them to understand our anger. I want them to be afraid. And on it goes. And this is a kind of call for vigilante justice. He goes on to tell a story about how he was with his father in a diner, and people were acting up in the diner, and the cops came in and just threw him out. Self-help. And it is very reminiscent of the kinds of things that I think are troubling about President Trump and his campaign. It is not simply the criticism of a judge that he's Mexican and therefore he can't be fair. Did you see in Suffolk County when he made that statement in front of police, and he said to them, well, when you put people in the police car, how you put your hands over their heads to make sure they don't get hurt? Well, don't be so nice and don't put your hands over their head. And essentially was justifying, calling for, you want to be rough with these people. You want to make them scared. And this is, he said this in 1989, 1990. So Kevin, tell us how you and your colleagues reacted. Tell us how your mother reacted to this.
Okay, how much time we got?
Well, right after this, we'll take your questions.
Donald Trump. I can't even say my president, because that's how personal it is to myself and my family. When he took this ad out, my mother told me a story that it hurted her and our parents, because it took her back to, my mother grew up in the South, when it was actually things like this going on. It was lynchings and things of that nature. And she grew up in the South where it was, she said it was like a KKK rally, because he physically spearheaded a movement and portrayed hate against us without knowing who we were. So I think, like during this case, the public was, when you look at the media and you look at us, the public was swayed to think that we were these kind of animals. And I think at the time, if it was a little bit of logic used, if you took a step back and seen this cannot be true. But Donald Trump, he didn't believe that. And still to this day, they asked him a question about it last year, and he said, oh, if they're guilty, they're guilty. Despite no DNA evidence, despite anything you see within the film or the documents, it doesn't make sense. So when he took this ad out, I was incarcerated at the time, and I'm hearing about it when I was incarcerated, that there are people that's out there that want us dead, and that hurt it. And to this day, it still hurts, because even after my case was overturned, if they would ask him a question, what do you feel now, Donald Trump? If he would have said, well, I rushed to judgment that time, I was wrong. But he's still sticking to his arrogant ways. And that's what hurts the most. Because actually, we would love to even sit down with him and look him in the face and wonder why he said that to us. But he doesn't want to speak to us, and he just believes what he believes. So if he had his way, I would not be here to this day talking to you. It went back to the days when people were lynched. Going back to days of Emmett Till, when he was killed for looking at a white woman. Because during that time, right now these days, everyone is together for the most part. But in '89, it was divided. It was white against black. And it was a harsh time to see. Now these days, the youth, we are evolving, and we need more people to make it better because of this man, because if it was up to him, he had people that's really following him, and they really want to make America great again. They really want to take it back to a slavery stage. So it's very hard to even see this to this day. And it's been 27 years ago. And that's how much it hurts deep inside to still see. Because yes, my case was overturned. Yes, I'm raising my family. But the five of us, we still have this invisible scar that nobody sees. And no money would cover that, So whenever I see this, I'm thinking about Donald Trump. It's just very harsh.
And I urge you to read it. And it's not. There are lots of people that may believe in capital punishment for the most heinous of crimes, and that's not necessarily a morally bankrupt position to take. Reasonable people could differ about it, although the death penalty, I don't think you can take a reasonable position in favor of the death penalty as it exists today, in terms of the race effects, in terms of our inability to get it right. The Innocence Movement has certainly demonstrated it. But what makes the Central Park 5 case so important to study and to understand, when you look at this ad, and you look at the things that Donald Trump's citizens said then, he wasn't a pariah for saying these things. And soon thereafter, when you look at the history of criminal justice in this country, we had laws that created mandatory minimum sentences. We had laws that were passed in Congress that cut back on federal habeas corpus. We had a whole shift. Even in the years when crime began going down, we had all these measures from which we are all trying to recover. And I really do believe that there's an alliance between conservatives and progressives to bring about criminal justice reform. But you will not understand the roots of resistance to this unless you look at the Central Park 5 case and tie it right back to all the problems we're suffering, and we see vividly in regard to the controversies arising out of Charlottesville. So I'm so thankful, Kevin, that you're here today to answer any questions. I'll certainly do my best. We ask you to join in the Innocence Movement, both here and across the world. The people here at Google and the people that will be watching this online, obviously go to the website of the Innocence Project and other organizations, give generously, but more to the point, give some thought to all the things that we're trying to do in science, forensic science, in cognitive science, in reforms that we can bring to this country. We've been able to accomplish a lot. And the good thing about the Innocence Movement, I hope you all realize that every time an innocent person is convicted, as happened to Kevin and his colleagues, the person who's really committed the crime, in this case Matthias Reyes, goes out and can commit at large another crime. And so this movement is about finding out what's wrong, correcting errors and fixing it, which is very hard in all kinds of institutions, and enhancing the capability of law enforcement and the court system and all the stakeholders to make sure we don't convict the innocent, but we do apprehend those who really did commit the crime. Thank you very much. And so I guess you can all line up and ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you for everything, both of you. I was wondering if you could speak briefly about the standards of evidence on paper needing to be overwhelming to convict someone. To get a conviction thrown out, do you just need to establish a reasonable doubt? Or are the standards equally high? Or is it even harder to get something overturned than it is to get the original conviction?
It's very hard to get something overturned. In most states, I think in actually just about every state right now, and it wasn't always true, there are statutes that say that a state must have a mechanism whereby new evidence of innocence can be brought forward so that a conviction can be vacated. In most states, the standard is a reasonable probability of a different outcome. The problem, when you talk about newly discovered evidence like that, is they define newly discovered evidence as evidence that couldn't have been found with the exercise of due diligence by the defense lawyer. So there's plenty of stuff that lawyers don't find. We won't go on at any great length about it, but Kevin's lawyer was not up to the task. And in the middle of the trial, they substituted in a new lawyer, all right? This case would have been hard under any circumstances, but when you go back and look at it, there was plenty of information, particularly the timeline, that raised doubts. Even some jurors in this case held out for a while because they said, wow, notwithstanding the publicity and the terrible way this looks, we see problems in this case. So reasonable probability of a different outcome is usually the standard. In some states, it's clear and convincing evidence of innocence. But the problem that we've had in the United States is that after a certain number of years, sometimes you can't get back into court. It is very, very, very hard. And also, if you want to claim ineffective assistance of counsel, and this is something that is very, very troubling, the standard for ineffective assistance of counsel, Peter Neufeld and I sometimes say jokingly, and our colleagues in the movement, if you put a mirror under the nose of the lawyer and it fogs up, that's an effective lawyer, right? It's very, very hard to reverse convictions on that ground. And one of the reasons is that they say, well, the standard is, what are the likely errors and omissions of lawyers in a community like you're practicing? And that is defined as too low. There should be a national objective norm of what constitutes effective assistance of counsel. There are jurisdictions all across this country where you show up the first time in court, there's no lawyers there, right? People plead guilty all the time. We have many, many great public defenders. But in general, in terms of all criminal justice reform, in my opinion, the least effective reform movement now is getting funds to represent people charged with crimes. And it is really the key, because if we want to deal with mass incarceration and you want to have a way to get people who are mentally ill out of the system, people who have substance abuse problems out of the system, people that have family violence problems out of the system and effectively treated, to know who should get bail and who shouldn't, to have a fair sentencing, it's got to be individualized. How can that really be done unless you have defense lawyers that know not just the defendant, but the whole family, that knew that Kevin was raised by women, that his mother was from Richmond, that knew the whole family context, that knew everything? You don't have that in this country because we don't give money sufficiently to those who are representing the poor. And a lot of it has to do with structural racism, but we need a Marshall Plan for indigent defense in this country. That's what we need, and we need to have it working together with all the stakeholders. So, you know, even if I told you we could change the legal standard, we'd still need lawyers to get it done. I guess over there.
Hi. Thank you, Kevin and Barry, both for being here. So I wanted to say, first of all, Kevin, I'm so sorry for what you went through, and I appreciate you being here to speak for what happened and to speak and to talk to us.
Thank you.
I do remember I was here a couple years ago when Central Park 5, when Sarah came in and showed that for us, and I saw that movie again. And I wanted to ask you in particular, I remember in that movie when she interviewed the journalist Jim Dwyer, and he talked about that he felt badly, that at the time he just kind of believed it, that everybody kind of believed it, that he didn't think a little harder about it and interrogate what the story that was being told. And I'm curious to know, when you, Kevin, when you see the news today, when things that are happening today, is there anything that you see that you think that doesn't seem right? I don't believe that, like from my experience. Is there a story that people are being told today that isn't quite right, that people are buying and believing now, but it's not quite right?
Yeah, well, personally, I guess from what I've been through, when I do see things on the news, I take a step back and actually analyze the situation, because you can't rush to judgment fast, and and you have to use a little logic actually, and especially now these days with so many things happening in this world, whether it's disasters or things that's happening, it's unbelievable to see. And speaking of like Jim Dwyer, during that time there was many reporters or people that maybe felt the same way, but during that time, not everybody, there was many that was on our side, but there was others that swayed the other way because they probably didn't want to be that one person that stand out and stand up for us, Like for instance, when Sarah Burns, when I actually first met her, myself and Raymond Santana met Sarah. When '89 happened, she was 6 years old, so she didn't even know anything about it. So she just wanted to find out more about our case. And long story short, she worked for a lawyer of mine, and she was an intern. And we met her. And myself, when I met her, I was like, who's this young lady that she's younger than me? But she really did her research, and she was very passionate about it because she wanted to make a difference. So we had one person like Sarah that would stand for it, we'll be better today. Of course, if we had more people like the Innocence Project, we'll be better. And I'm glad that we trying to make some kind of reform to make things better like that.
Now, I should add something about good journalism. So, and I told Kevin this story just the other day. When we were working with Nancy Ryan and Peter Castellaro reviewing the case, it's very hard to read these transcripts very quickly. So we picked up a book by a journalist named Tim Sullivan who worked for Court TV, and he was covering the case. And I'm reading this book, and I'm going, oh my God, he's accurately reciting everything that happened in this trial. It's a very easy read. He notes all the different contradictions, makes it look like a close case, right? Explains why the juror had all these doubts. So after that 7-month secret period, right, but before the announcement was made in court, I went to see him because Court TV had those offices on 3rd Avenue and like 40-something Street. I took him across the street to this bar called Doc's. I think it's still there, right? And sat him down and I said, I'm buying you a whiskey, okay? And I looked at him and I said, they're all innocent. And he's looking at me and he just couldn't believe it. And, of course, eventually he did and he understood it. But what was great about it is you could go back and find a document where somebody just looking objectively at the evidence contemporaneously was able to highlight all the problems. Because if you just watch the news, you'd think this was an open and shut case. Oh my God, they've got these confessions. Now, of course, by the time they turn on the cameras, people had been told what to say, taken to the scene of the crime, all kinds of things. And of course, they showed no remorse.
Hi, Thank you both for being here. My sister-in-law works for the Innocence Project, and she's in the process of applying to law school so she can kind of continue her passion.
Good.
So my question is sort of similar, but you shared this advertisement, and there was a headline that you shared of a newspaper, and so I was just curious your perspective on 30 years later, the media landscape has changed, and in theory, we are able to kind of get access to more information. Sometimes people are even posting videos of things that they've observed online, that they've seen from the scene of the crime. And do you think that helps or hurts? And are things getting better or worse? What is the role of the media companies in sort of helping to mitigate some of these issues that you guys brought up? If you have a perspective, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I think it helps now because people are more aware, and thank God for internet and media, because people really want to know the truth. And like situations that's happening now, as far as police brutality, you see it. People are filming it. It's online. You Google it. You check it out. And so I think it helps out because people just want to know for themselves what happened. And for example, as far as like now videotape is you can see it, the footage now, because in my case, you didn't see anything that was happening behind closed doors. So now you see that, now you can see what's going on, and maybe it'll be a little change. So I think it helps, actually.
Well, it's complicated. As you know, I'm here at Google. As Kevin said, there is so much more information out that you can get quickly, right? You can get transcripts. You can go online and look at decisions and look up people and look at their Facebook pages and the social media and get so much more information than you ever could before. And there are increasingly websites that on criminal justice issues are terrific, like the Marshall Project. I highly recommend that. Those of us in the criminal justice reform movement, we get up in the morning, we look at the Marshall Project. But what I want to commend to your attention about the Marshall Project is the person who really started it is Bill Keller, who was an editor of the New York Times. And all the people that are involved in the Marshall Project and other journalists that they bring in to write articles, they care about facts. They care about what's truthful. They'll be politically incorrect when it comes to looking at solutions to the problems. I think it's great that there are all kinds of other websites that can do this, and investigative teams like the people at ProPublica. It's a heyday now for, publications like The Atlantic have been terrific, and of course The New Yorker and others that will do deep dives and investigative reports. But what's so important now is that we have to stop being so tribalized, right? You really have to search the web and look for facts. And I'm hopeful, we don't have it now, but I'm hopeful that what will happen is that we will begin to get authoritative voices, whether they're on the left or the right or anywhere, where you will have some assurance that what I'm seeing online here so quickly has actually been fact-checked, that responsible people are doing the research, so we'll get some confidence in the truth of what's being reported. These democratic rights that we have, the presumption of innocence, trial by jury, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, you think these things are just going to be here forever and work? Wake up. Unless you fight for them, people will say, well, be scared. Let's go punish them. I didn't make this up. Go look at that ad that President Trump, when he was a citizen, raised. I mean, this is what he really believed, and he wasn't run out of town because he said it. And I wish he would really give it more thought. Nobody should be considered hopeless in this kind of enterprise. But if you want a democracy, you're going to have to fight for it. If you want a fair criminal justice system, you're going to have to fight for it. Because it is really imperiled and under attack in many ways today. On the other hand, I'm extremely optimistic myself that people such as yourselves will look at this history, learn the lessons, bring to bear real science in looking at how this system can work, and will protect the innocent and try our very best to convict only those who committed the crimes.
Thanks so much for having this event and speaking here. I have a kind of obvious question, which is like I can appreciate is probably very difficult to answer. But is there any research done to estimate the number of people that are currently incarcerated that are innocent?
Well,
How many are there?
yeah, it's a great question, and people ask all the time, how many innocent people are in jail? And the answer to that is, well, if I knew, I'd tell you. We have huge backlogs at the Innocence Project and innocence organizations across the country of people claiming to be innocent that we're, trying to help all of our colleagues and look at. But I would, a very good study was done by Sam Gross from the University of Michigan Law School, and I think Barbara O'Brien from Michigan State, that was published in the National Academy of Science Journal. Because in order to get a handle on this question, you have to compare apples to apples. And I can tell from your question that you understand the difficulties of this. And we do have a class of cases that we can look at, and that is capital cases. Because we have more data on those, we have more transcripts, more of them gone through the court system. And then, frankly, even though capital representation isn't as good over the years as it should have been, it is better ordinarily, or more resources are devoted to it, let's put it that way, than the average case. And what they've been able to estimate is that the error rate is at least 4%. And they were comparing, capital cases over a period of time where they could look at real evidence of innocence compared to other cases. What? Well, that is absolutely, you're quite correct in saying the questioner said that's so high, and of course it's high when you consider that we have, something like more than 2 million people incarcerated in the United States, more per capita than just about anywhere. And then you look at a lot of these states like Louisiana, which has the highest per capita incarceration rate of any jurisdiction on the planet, right? And that's one reason we get all these innocent people out in Louisiana. There's plenty of them there. So the rate is very high. There's other data that is very suggestive about this. When we first began doing DNA testing starting in 1989 and moving forward, and the FBI was one of the few public agencies that would do it for state and local law enforcement for free, they were finding consistently when they had a suspect in a case, right, which in theory meant that there was some probable cause or reasonable basis for picking somebody up, arresting them, charging them, and then they would move forward with the DNA testing, that in one third of the time, the primary suspect was excluded by the DNA testing. So that is, very, very suggestive that the rate of innocent people being convicted is much higher than any of us ever thought. And that is the truth. I think that the one thing you'll find from our colleagues in the prosecution, we get a lot of support from the International Associations of Chiefs of Police, from policing people all across the country, because police officers, when they go into it, they didn't get into it and risking their lives because they want to lock up the wrong person. They want to lock up the right person and protect the public. But, we need to make that job easier. We need to bring more science to bear on this. We need to change those institutions so we can get better at it. It's a very difficult and imperfect enterprise, and we have to constantly be improving this system. But there's no doubt. That's what DNA and the innocence movement proved, I think, to everybody's satisfaction among stakeholders in the criminal court system, that there are far more innocent people than anybody ever suspected. And we are still at the beginning of this process. I mean, when we started this 25 years ago, this is our 25th anniversary of the Innocence Project, and you'll see Time Magazine did a whole issue that you can find on this on the newsstands right now, because it is an important historical and cultural and political development to see an innocence movement. Everybody thought that as more DNA testing was done at the beginning of a case, right, that we'd all go out of business. Well, the answer is we have more exonerations, which you look at the National Registry numbers, than ever before. And, you know, the DNA has remained constant in terms of the number of old cases and even some new ones where the DNA wasn't done right. We've been able to exonerate people. But we now know more about how innocent people get convicted and get better at trying to correct these errors. So that's a very, you're right, it's a complicated question. If you put a gun to my head and said, what's the error rate, I'll go with the article in the National Academy of Science Journal, at least 4%.
So that's like 100,000 people.
Oh, it's more than that. In truth, I mean, if you know, guessing. But we don't like to guess. We like to bring all the data that we can to bear on the problem. So I think that's it. And we thank you very, very much. And hope for your support. Anyone in the Innocence movement, go online, innocenceproject.org, Innocent Network, any innocence organization in your jurisdiction, and help us.